Let's continue by talking about the Gospel of Mark. And we are talking about, of course, the shortest gospel. I would argue we're talking about the most dramatic gospel. Not to say that the others are not dramatic, but connected to the conciseness, the shortness of Mark's gospel. He takes many of the same events that we read in the other gospels, and you can even do this comparison. And you'll find that these events are packed one after another in such a concise way and in such a dramatic way that you can't help coming away from reading the gospel and feeling like he is just a fabulous storyteller. He's telling you this dramatic story, and with these patterns, the pattern that is often translated in our translations as immediately, the impression you get is, and then right after that, and then you won't believe what happened next. And it has this rapid fire feel to it. The life of Jesus Christ rushing by, rushing towards ultimately his sacrifice of himself, his death on our behalf. It's a beautiful and fabulously enjoyable gospel. Now, let me talk about one or two things before we go further with this. And one is, I do want to take a moment and compare the gospels. On a couple of different points, we'll talk about these. One, initially, you should know about the concept of the synoptics. And I'll just show you a chart here. I won't spend too much time on it. If you want, you can go back and take a look at it later. Some of the things on this chart people have disagreements about, but what you're going to see is a rough division, kind of showing you how much content is used between the different Gospels and how much is shared between the different Gospels. So a good amount of content in Matthew also appears in Mark or also appears in Luke. And just to see those relationships visually expressed, I find this chart handy or helpful. This is just taken from Wikipedia, so plenty of room to quibble about percentages. But if you just recognize where it says tradition, all that means is content that is shared between. And you recognize under that category, the purple is shared. It says triple tradition, just simply means that occurs in all three of these Gospels. That's a huge portion of the Gospel of Mark. 75%, okay, so adjust it by 5 or 10%. In that ballpark, the majority, more than half of Mark, also does appear in Luke and Matthew. And then the rest, among what remains, a good piece of that is shared with Matthew. So that what we're talking about that's truly unique just to Mark, under 10%. And that, I think, is the point that I want to make here just for starting out. Not so much the details of the percentages, but just for you to see the concept of what we mean by synoptics. Synoptics, seeing together, or seeing through a similar lens. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are shared in the sense that they have significant amounts of content that are similar between all three of the books. In fact, in some cases, it's actually shared verbal content. What I mean is, it's not just that they tell the same event, but they actually use some of the same wording in some of the same word order, enough that though it's difficult to establish which book was written first or how this worked, enough that it does appear that at least one or two of the authors had access to one of the other books, and they were using some of the same content. And there's no problem with our theology of inspiration in that. Actually, we have a lot of places across Scripture where Scripture will explicitly tell us. And so then here is a record drawn from this other work. And when God uses another source like that, then his inspiration or his guidance applies also to that source. So in terms of when we hear the synoptics, I just want you to know that's what's going on here. The recognition that three of the four Gospels share a lot of content together. Another concept that demands our attention is to understand then what is the relationship between the four Gospels, as in how are they similar, how are they different. And a couple of comments here. Because we're human, and because part of our nature tell me simply and clearly, what's the difference between that and that and that? If you line up 3 or 4 similar things, then immediately your temptation is focus on the differences and forget about all the similarities between them. And the result of that is that there are all kinds of schemes that have been proposed for what the 4 Gospels emphasize, or the themes, or what makes them different. Some of these get almost a little bit funny. Here's an example of an old scheme that goes back to, do you remember in Revelation you have these living creatures with 4 faces? Okay. Well, at some point, someone looked at that and said, aha, 4 Gospels. That must be it. And so you end up with schemes like this, where you have one Gospel that's supposed to be like the face of a man, and the other like an eagle in flight, and like a lion, and like an ox. And it's an attempt to try to connect that together. Okay? I find that very unpersuasive. But more common and closer to reality is another scheme that works like this, where we look at the same 4 Gospels, looking for 4 themes. And we end up concluding that our scheme will work like this. Matthew presents Jesus as the perfect king. Mark presents Jesus as the perfect servant. Luke presents Jesus as the perfect man. And John presents Jesus as God. That's good. There are still some weaknesses here. One other comment I should mention in passing, another common scheme is to say that Matthew is the gospel for the Jews, Mark is the gospel for the Romans, Luke is the gospel for the Greeks, John is the gospel for the world. That works okay for Matthew. I'm not sure that it works that well for the other gospels. John, sure, for the world, because we have that theme that comes up there. But again, there's a little bit of a slotting and a little bit too simple of a scheme in each one of those cases. So I'm going to propose a different notion as just, I guess, a foundational way of thinking about it for starters. And my initial concept here will be, instead of focusing on the differences, let's recognize the massive similarities between the 4 Gospels. Okay, what do I mean by that, or how will this work? Well, I'll give you an illustration, and I'd like you to think of this series of paintings, which is an absolutely fabulous series. I do like Impressionists. I like a lot of other kinds of art too, but one of the styles I like in Impressionism, Claude Monet did a series of paintings of the same church in different lighting. Okay, and it's really fabulous and really beautiful. You're looking at the same subject, and he's just showing between morning light, afternoon light, evening light, how much this subject changes. Now, part of the reason that this series works is because the subject itself is so complex. In other words, I don't know that this would be so great if it was just a landscape, maybe. But the complexity of the subject allows the light and the colors to come out. And it gives so much opportunity and richness. But as well, together with that, him giving you different lightings and different perspectives helps you understand the richness of the subject better. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for what we've got going on with the Gospels. Rather than just focusing on the differences, as if we could take Mark, throw away all the things that are similar to the other Gospels, just focus on the different stuff. Well, if you do that, you broke the book. And the way to handle the synoptics is not to always just say, well, this is the different part, but to be aware and recognize as a whole, what is the entire book presenting the picture of Jesus Christ? And recognizing that between the 4 Gospels, and especially between the 3 synoptics, there is massive overlap. So that if we are determined from the beginning to only talk about but what is the distinctive theme of Mark, we might end up missing the whole theme in the process. We might discover instead that the overlap between the Gospels is as important as the differences between them. So that's where I'm going to start as a foundation. I just mentioned the 4 theme scheme for Mark. So Jesus, or for the Gospels, Matthew presents Jesus as king, Luke presents Jesus as the perfect man, John presents Jesus as God, and Mark presents Jesus as servant. Let me talk about that last one for a second. The theme of servant, there is a history on it. You can trace some of this history. People did not always recognize the theme of servant as the theme for Mark. And they don't always recognize it today. So there are people who look at the theme of servant and are not convinced that that really is the theme in Mark. I happen to be one of those people. And it's an interesting study to look through and actually follow through. What is going on? Is the theme of servant the central theme of the Gospel of Mark? Possibly. But if you start paying attention to some of the details, you'll notice a few things that raise questions for me. One, if you just look through and pull out all of the servant-serving passages or explicit explanations of that, or really whatever is connected in some way to the concept of servant or serving, all three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, share that content. In other words, it really is not that Mark emphasizes this more. All of the major servant passages also appear in Matthew. They also appear in Luke. So there's no special kind of emphasis within Mark that goes more heavily down this route. Okay, what about the key verse? Because the verse that often comes up in this discussion is Mark 10:45. Even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. Well, it's a significant, theologically speaking, very significant and beautiful verse to recognize this is a description of the ministry of Jesus Christ, and this is what he did. He came as a servant. So the richness of connecting that to his life as a ransom for many, beautiful. I just want to point out, though, that the exact same verse and basically same wording appears in Matthew. So essentially, whatever arguments I can make for Mark presenting Jesus Christ as servant, whatever arguments I can make for Mark, I can make the exact same arguments for Matthew, presenting Jesus Christ as servant. And there's no problem with that, I don't think, to recognize, like I said earlier, that you've got different perspectives on the same reality, Jesus. So that, sure, I mean, the theme appears in Mark, the theme appears in Matthew. I'm just not convinced that that is the central theme or the key way to understand the book of Mark when all of the same content appears in the other Gospels. One other argument. If there's any story, anecdote, picture, pericope section that illustrates Jesus Christ as servant, what would be the most dramatic example of this? And if you just think through what you know of the Gospels for a little bit, I think what you'll come up with is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Okay, because he's putting himself in the role of a servant. And here is that account, and it's a beautiful account. Pouring water in a basin, washing the disciples' feet, wiping with the towel wherewith he was girded. I mean, this is a perfect picture of servanthood. Okay, well, just so we recognize, I'll scroll up. Where did this happen? It's John. And it's only recorded in John. It doesn't appear in the synoptics at all. That doesn't necessarily prove that Mark can't emphasize servanthood. It's just an interesting insight. In other words, I have a pretty good case that Matthew emphasizes servanthood just as much. I could almost go to John and say, because of this passage and other emphases, you could put some things together and make an argument that John emphasizes servanthood. And it illustrates my point. Again, I don't know that focusing on the differences between the Gospels is so productive as maybe recognizing that they're giving different angles on the same reality, and you could make as good a case for servanthood from the other Gospels as from the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so if the theme is not servant, what is the theme? What is Mark about anyway? What is the emphasis of the Gospel of Mark? I'll start out with the very beginning of the Gospel. And I'm going to do something similar to, it'll be something similar to what we had in the Gospel of John, to recognize that the Gospel of Matthew, the very first verse of the Gospel gives us an introduction and a picture into understanding the rest of the Gospel. Here it is, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Okay, couple of concepts here. Number one, the beginning, I talked about that in Matthew, almost gives you a starting in Genesis sort of flavor. And here we have this again. Here, let's start out. Jesus is the beginning. Here is the beginning of something dramatic. The beginning of the good news, gospel. And so Mark is going to proclaim to you the exciting, joyful news that the Old Testament anticipated and waited for. He has come. Jesus Christ, we lose the meaning here because we're too familiar with it now. So let's try it this way. Jesus the Messiah. Christ is the word Messiah. It's just the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. So the beginning of the good news of Jesus, who is the Messiah. He's telling you that this fulfills everything that the Old Testament waited for. The Son of God, Jesus' unique relationship with the Father as the one sent by the Father. And then here's what's so extraordinary about the gospel. You have that one theological statement, and verse 2, immediately you're in. There's no discussion here of, there's not a genealogy. There's no discussion here of, for instance, like a birth narrative or background, or here are his parents, or here was he was born. You go straight in, verse 2, talking about John the Baptist and the people going out and repenting and confessing their sins. And immediately, verse 9, we're already here. We're introduced to Jesus. And Jesus is introduced to us as just coming from Nazareth and baptized of John. And we're already, it's only verse 10 in chapter 1, and we already have the baptism of Jesus Christ and his being identified as the beloved Son of the Father. Immediately after, we're in the temptation. And just look at how concise the temptation here. He was in the wilderness. He was there 40 days, tempted of Satan. And he overcame, and the angels ministered to him. I mean, it's compact. There is no extra space in here. We're flying through this gospel. And in this first part of the gospel, what we're going to see already is an illustration or a description of this emphasis and this theme. The first half of the gospel is going to focus on the question of who is Jesus? What is his identity? Who is he? Specifically, the answer, Jesus is the Messiah. Remember, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Who is Jesus? This is who he is. Now, that compactness or that dramatic storytelling that starts out already in the beginning of the gospel, it's just going to keep on happening. I can't give you an impression of how dramatic or how rapid fire this is unless you just start reading through the gospel yourself. But what you can do is I'll just show you. We'll just look at a couple of passages here in chapter 1, continuing down through chapter 2. I'm trying to give you a sense of how quickly and how dramatically things move in this gospel, as well as the point that Mark keeps on making. Immediately, there's in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit crying out, and Jesus cast out the demon so that people around him are saying, what is this? What new doctrine is this? With what authority he commands the unclean spirits and they obey him? His fame spread throughout that whole region. Next story. They're come out of the synagogue. I mean, here it is, how direct and how immediate. Forthwith, immediately, when they're come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon, Peter, and Andrew, and James, and John. And his mother is sick, and he heals her. And when then the evening comes, then all who are diseased, and those who are possessed with devils, and the whole city was gathered together at the door, and he healed many. He gets up the next morning, he's praying, and immediately Jesus is saying to them, come, let us go to the next towns, So they go to the next towns, they preach in the synagogues, they cast out their devils. And we're continuing on a story of a leper. We're continuing on chapter 2 now, and the story of the paralytic who's lowered through the roof. People afterwards asking questions, who is this? We never saw anything like this. This is so dramatic. And it just keeps on going, miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. Overwhelming authority and power. With the continuing question that I mentioned before, and the core for this first part of the gospel, who is this person? That's illustrated in a couple of ways. You're going to see themes emphasized in this section. Jesus' power in all of the miracles that he performs. Jesus' authority. Who has the right to forgive sins but God alone? And you're going to see an ongoing motif or repeated pattern of overwhelming response. We just saw it a second ago. But this notion that people are coming in throngs. Jesus goes and he heals all of their sick and all who have diseases, and the crowds just keep on coming and coming and coming. In specific cases, to the point that there's no room for them even to fit in. They can't even come in at the door because there's just too many people. And this repeated pattern becomes a critical part of Jesus' ministry. Let me pause for a second on that specific point. One of the things that might happen to you as you read the Gospel of Mark, you might hit these places where you're a little bit surprised and a little bit challenged because it sounds like Jesus doesn't want people to spread the news about him. Okay, let me show you a couple of examples. So one of these, Jesus performs a healing, and immediately after performing the healing, he warns the person he healed not to spread the news about him. Okay, and you look at this and you're a little shocked because I thought that the goal was to spread the news as far as we could go. I thought we want everybody to know about Jesus Christ. So what is he doing? Mark 5:43, he charged them straightly that no man should know it. Here's another example, chapter 7, verse 36. He charged them that they should tell no one. Why is Jesus doing this? You've got other places in the gospel where actually Jesus will tell people, don't go and tell anyone else that I am the Messiah. Okay, here one example that we'll continue or that we'll look at a little bit later, Mark chapter 8, verse 30. When Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus then immediately charges Peter, tell no man who I am. Tell no man that I am the Messiah. Well, that sounds like the very opposite of what I'm supposed to do. I thought I'm supposed to tell anybody who will listen, or even if they don't, that Jesus is the Messiah. So why would Jesus kind of be hiding the fact that he is the Messiah? And a couple of things to say about that. Number one, this has developed into, sometimes you hear it called the messianic secret, an idea that Jesus is hiding the truth about him. That misses something. And what it misses is that there are many passages, quite a few, where Jesus actually tells people, go out and tell anyone the good news about me. So Jesus is not embarrassed, or Jesus is not trying to hide his claims. He is very open about his claims. Here are some examples of that. Jesus said to this man, go after he healed the demoniac, go home, tell your friends. So the man went and he began to publish how great things Jesus had done for him. Here in chapter 6, verse 12, Jesus told the disciples to go and preach the news. So they went out. He sent them like emissaries, like missionaries. And you can see this in Matthew. You can see this across the Gospels. Jesus sent his disciples also to spread the news. So one answer we have is, no, Jesus was not hiding the truth about himself. There are other reasons, though, that at times Jesus did hide the truth or did stop people from talking about him. One example is that Jesus will sometimes say to demons, stop saying what you're saying. Okay, and part of the reason is that demons are actually blaspheming him by speaking things like, you are the Son of God. It's almost an ironic, backwards way of them dishonoring him. I think a more significant reason is that there was just a practicality issue. There are cases where Jesus has so many crowds coming to him, he's preaching from a boat. We just saw earlier in chapter 1, he's inside of a house and no one can get inside. And so you've got a concept, just practically speaking, if the news about his miracles spreads, he won't even be able to reach all the people that are coming. It's just too many people. But there's actually something deeper still. And that is, people are coming to Jesus for the wrong reasons. Okay, there are examples or illustrations of this, for instance, in John chapter 2, John chapter 6. Jesus emphasizes with people coming to him, you aren't coming to me for my teaching, you're coming to me for the food. You're coming to me for the healings. And one of the big ideas that happens in the Gospels is Jesus demonstrating he's not just a free clinic. He's not just a way for people to get free medical care and free food. You're going to have to listen to his teaching. And if then spreading the news means going and telling people, hey, he healed me and you can get healed too, Jesus doesn't want that message going out about him. More deep still is to recognize that all throughout his ministry, people are wanting to know, is he the Messiah? Is he the Messiah? But their understanding of Messiah is off. When they hear Messiah, they hear the one who will come and bring victory, earthly victory, over our earthly oppressors. They're not recognizing Messiah as the one who will suffer and die for their sins. And part of the concept then going on here is Jesus doesn't want a message spread about him, Messiah, 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 when what they're hearing with the word Messiah is something that's not true about him at all. One of the proofs for this is that after Jesus' death and resurrection, you'll discover he's very open and he tells the disciples to freely go and declare that he is the Messiah. Why? It's now obvious what that means. So this is, I hope, maybe a little bit of a help for understanding what's going on. When you read cases of Jesus saying something like, don't tell, don't communicate what's happening, or don't talk about who I am as Messiah. It's not that Jesus is hiding the truth, but it is the recognition that many people misunderstand what is his actual identity. That takes me then to talk about the center of the book. And if I was going to give you anything that you must remember about the Gospel of Mark, you have to remember the center of the book, which is the Grand Confession. Now, one or two comments here first. This Grand Confession, as I'm calling it, is something that's shared also in at least the other synoptics, and plays a critical role in Matthew. Matthew 16 is the same passage. It's the passage where Peter comes and there's a discussion, or Jesus says to the disciples, who do you say that I am? Peter answers, you are the Messiah. And that turning point is has a central role in the Gospel of Matthew as well. But I would argue maybe even more of a central role in Mark. And let's just look at the passage, and then I want to talk about a few other pieces surrounding it. So here, Mark 8:27, this is the discussion, who do people say that I am? John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. Here's the confession, you are the Christ. And Jesus' responds to that immediately afterwards. Now, the reason that I'm understanding this is so significant is because I view it as a hinge. What I mean by a hinge, I view this passage as standing at the center of the book, the focal point of the book, with the major themes of the book surrounding it and all pointing back here. Let me show you what I mean by that first, and I'll show it to you in chart form. What I place, if I'm trying to put together the themes of the book, what I place at the very center is this Grand Confession. Peter's confession, you are the Messiah. But I already said to you that I view the first half of the book as focused on the identity of Jesus Christ. Who is he? Who is Jesus? And the answer is he is the Messiah, the Son of God. In fact, supporting that concept, go back to the passage we were just looking at, and I want to show you that everything building up across the passage comes to this point. And it is in fact answering the question, who is Jesus? He is the Messiah. So here, that is the question that Jesus actually asked them. Who am I? Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And it is to illustrate that coming into this hinge, the entire first half of the book, I'm arguing, is asking this critical question: who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? When I arrive at chapter 8, that's the question. Who do people say that I am? Here's the answer. Jesus is the Messiah. And this central hinge, this grand confession coming in, links up all of chapters 1 to 8. All of chapters 1 to 8 lead here. Who is Jesus? The Messiah. Okay, well, if that's chapters 1 through 8, what about 9 to 16? What's happening there? And the answer is, you're going to see it right here in the passage. What comes next? Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected. He must be killed. After 3 days, rise again. In fact, it's not just here, but just a bit later in the chapter, Jesus is going to emphasize the same notions again. You're going to see concepts right away where Jesus again is saying, if anyone will save his life, he will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Why? Because you've got to come after me, take up my cross. I mean, it's this emphasis of Jesus suffering and dying on a cross. And just a bit later, you're already going to see in the next chapter a discussion of Jesus' upcoming death. You're going to see discussion of the disciples following him in that kind of suffering. And the rest of the book now is going to emphasize this concept of suffering. So that then is my understanding of the second half of the book. If the first half of the book answered the question, who is Jesus? The second half of the book now shifts, and the question moves to, what will he do? What is coming up in terms of the rest of his life? Well, the answer, he's going to suffer, he's going to die, he's going to rise again. That emphasis is going to be major now, growing in conflict with the religious leaders, teaching the disciples all around that question. Who is he? Verses chapters 1 to 8. What will he do? Chapters 9 to 16. Just to illustrate that quickly, let me show you other passages that are going to talk about his suffering. We already read several of these, but chapter 10, verse 33, we go up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man shall be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes. They shall condemn him to death, scourge him, spit on him, mock him, kill him. Chapter 12 is an illustration of some of this. They kill the Son. They kill the one that the Father sends. Chapter 14, the Son of Man goes, and he's going to be betrayed. Chapter 14, again, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. And there are others still. So these remaining chapters are full of this kind of concept. And these then are the two questions that the Gospel of Mark presents. Who is Jesus? What will he do? I'm going to go back to chapter 8, and I want to unpack one other idea for you here. There's lots more that we could say and lots more to try to understand about this. But for simplicity's sake, chapter 8 is going to start off with a question of faith. And that's the last piece of the puzzle I want to put into our discussion here. Who is Jesus? What will he do? Mark's question is, do you have faith in the person of the Messiah? Let me illustrate that. So, Mark chapter 8, Jesus feeds the multitudes. And this is the feeding of the 4,000. When it's done, he sends them away, and now it's he and the disciples. Straight away, immediately, they entered into a ship. And the Pharisees came forth, and they began to question him, seeking a sign from heaven. Jesus answered, why does this generation seek after a sign? There shall be no sign given into this generation. Why and what's happening here? Pause and for a second and recognize that Jesus just fed 4,000 people using just a few loaves. And from just a few loaves, he feeds this massive crowd. Okay, now, if what you were looking at was some kind of proof that he's genuine or legitimate or that he really has power, how about this? in the middle of the wilderness. Okay, I don't know how you can pull off a magic trick like a hidden door or something like that, or behind the curtain, or it's actually secretly coming down from above. Mirrors. It's in the middle of the wilderness. A crowd of 4,000 people. Magic tricks are a whole lot easier if you can bring somebody up on the stage and control it up there. But not just 4,000 people. I mean, all of them are witnesses, right? Not just the guy on the stage. 4,000 people are witnesses. But not just that they see something. Maybe you could do something with mirrors or something. Not just that they see something, but they eat the food and it fills their stomachs. It has to be real. And that amount of money in the wilderness, I mean, that amount of food in the wilderness, if you just wanted to get it out there logistically, it cost a lot of money. And it's physically hard to move that much food into a wilderness. In other words, this is my point. This is basically an impossible miracle to fake. I don't think you can fake this. And if you're then looking for a proof that Jesus is actually true, that he really does have power, this is like an ultimate miracle. I don't even know, how do you even deny this miracle? So that starts off then explaining what's already happening just so far in this story. Jesus has performed this amazing and indisputable miracle, and immediately these are coming to him, his critics, and they're asking for a sign. Give us some proof. And Jesus' answer to them rightly is, there is no sign for you. I've given you a sign. I've given you all the proof anyone could ask for. How can your minds be so dark that you still reject me? Okay, watch what happens next. That's the Pharisees, those are the bad guys. Verse 14, now the disciples had forgotten to take bread. And so now they're in the boat and there's no lunch. And Jesus says to them, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And the disciples start to discuss with each other, oh no, we don't have lunch. We have no bread. What are we going to do? Do you see the irony of this? Or do you see, actually we'll just say, the absurdity of this? Because the disciples are concerned now about a problem of lunch, a problem of bread. And what you're supposed to do in the narrative is just rewind just a little bit, go back a few verses, and just right back here, look, he fed 4,000 people. He had a few fishes and a few pieces of bread. 4,000 people went home with their stomachs full. And so the disciples really are now going to worry about lunch? Watch Jesus dealing with them graciously and kindly, mercifully, but pointedly. Jesus deals with the disciples and starts to ask questions like this. Wait. Why are you wondering about this? Do you not understand? Have your hearts been hardened? Do you not see? Do you not hear? Do you not remember? And he's going to do some review. Okay, let's go back. Let's just review the past. Okay, I broke 5 loaves among 5,000. How many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they can give him the right answer. They can do math. 12. Good job. Okay, you remember. 12. And how about this? I fed 4,000 people. How many baskets did you take up? And they said 7. Very good. You remember numbers. Okay, so you can do numbers. That's good. I'm glad you have numbers. How is it that you don't understand? And what I've got here is an illustration of the basic fact. Jesus is giving people information. Jesus is giving people proof. Jesus is showing extraordinary, undeniable, clear miracles. And yet, even with all the miracles and with all the clarity, they can still manage to doubt and question the reality about him. And it's not just the Pharisees that doubt him, but now here it is even the disciples who question and doubt. One other really interesting detail of what happens here and how this continues to develop. The next story doesn't seem to fit. They bring a blind man to him. They asked him to touch him to heal him. He took the blind man by the hand. He led him out of the town. He spit on his eyes. And then he said to the man, "Do you see anything?" The man looked up and he said, "I see men as trees walking." Then he put his hand again upon the man's eyes. He made him look up again, and the man was restored and saw everything clearly. So what's happening here? Well, a couple of points about the story that make it, I guess I would just say, a little bit odd. Number one, placement. Okay, so what I just read, we had the feeding of the 4,000, the Pharisees' doubt, the disciples' doubt. The next passage that comes after this is the grand confession. And so here, the grand confession is like the most dramatic passage, the turning point of the entire book. It's a very, very important passage. And that important passage, you could have that, and then right before that, this build-up of the question of faith. I mean, that would be natural enough. It's almost strange, particularly for a brilliant storyteller like Mark. It's almost strange that right before the grand confession, you have this odd miracle of Jesus partially healing somebody. What's it doing there? Another thing that makes this a little bit odd. Jesus heals the man partially, and then he heals him the rest of the way. Okay, look at the wording again and specifically how this happens. Jesus heals the man. Jesus says to him, "Do you see anything?" And the man says, "I see men as trees walking," meaning I see things, but it's kind of blurry. So Jesus put his hands on him again, and after that he was restored fully and he saw everything clearly. What's going on here? I mean, it almost sounds like an optometrist visit or something. Right? You know, if you've ever done the eye doctor thing, you go in and they put the lenses on and okay, how's that? It's pretty good, but maybe not perfect. How's that? Now that's perfect. Okay, and so they're having to ask you and get feedback because they don't know. So they've got to find out what is your right prescription by asking. And it almost could sound a little bit like that. Jesus heals him part of the way. Okay, can you see anything? Still blurry. Okay, how about that now? Okay, now I see. That's not what's going on. Nothing like this ever happens apart from here. And let's recognize it. Jesus does not need to try a second time. Okay, I'll heal you. Okay, I guess I didn't give it enough oomph. Let me give it another try. Okay, how's that one? That one did it. When Jesus wants to heal people, he heals people. And it's done. Jesus doesn't need to do it part of the way. So why on earth would I have this miracle where Jesus partially heals the person and then heals him the rest of the way? And as I said earlier, why is this passage then immediately followed by the grand confession, dramatic passage of the entire book? And I think there's an answer here. I believe the answer is that this account is illustrating for you the responses to Jesus, a response of unbelief, a response of faith, a response of some kind of confused, blurry vision part of the way, moving the right direction, but not quite understanding. Let me show you, let me argue my point, and let's see if this fits the passage. So here the concept, do you see anything? The man says, I see, but I only see partially. Do I have any illustrations nearby in the passage where that kind of thing is going on? Well, go back just a little bit earlier, and here I had Pharisees coming to Jesus seeking a sign. Jesus' answer to them is, no sign for you. Why? These people are blind, stone cold blind. No matter how many miracles they see, no matter how much proof they receive, they will not believe. These people are blind. Completely blind. But I have some other people here. The disciples, they are positively inclined toward Jesus. They're his followers. And they're concerned about things that he says. I mean, when Jesus says things like "Beware of the Pharisees," then okay, well, is he talking about lunch? Okay, what? I mean, they're trying in a way to be followers, but Jesus' emphasis to them: okay, you have a kind of a faith, but you don't understand. Your hearts are hardened. How is it even possible that you don't understand? And let's bump up a little bit later to the grand confession. Right here, that Jesus says to them, who am I? The answer, you are the Messiah, Peter's answer. And Jesus confirms that. I am the Messiah. Well, I mean, sounds to me like Peter has excellent faith. Sounds like Peter understands the truth. Good for Peter. You are the Messiah. Yes, Peter. Good job. Yes, you got it. Hooray, we're good. Okay. Peter understands, Peter has faith. Watch this. As soon as Jesus tells them, though, that the Son of Man must suffer and be rejected and be killed, Peter took him and began to rebuke him. And Jesus, in response to Peter, rebukes him, "Get thee behind me, Satan. You might be called my disciple, but right now you're speaking words that are satanic. The words you're speaking right now come straight from the Prince of Darkness." Peter, the one who just confessed that Jesus is the Messiah, yes, faith, good, turns around and rebukes Jesus and corrects him. No, Peter, no. And what's happening here, and the point would go, it is possible to have a kind of faith, but it's a kind of faith that is broken, blurry, partial. And in the illustration of the miracle we just talked about a moment ago, then what we have now are people who, they're not blind, they can see, but look at them. They see as trees walking. They look out and they see blurry shapes. They don't yet get it. They don't yet understand the full picture. And this miracle, which otherwise could seem odd, is really strategic and beautiful, placed right here on purpose to show you what it looks like to have a kind of a faith, but an incomplete faith. To put those pieces together and to finish out our time then, we recognize in the rest of the book, as the rest of the Gospel of Mark unfolds this truth, what will he do? Suffer, die, and rise again. There is, together with that, a contrast up above. The religious leaders are going to increasingly reject Jesus. For the rest of the book, their rejection becomes palpable, becomes deep and dark and awful, horrifying. The religious leaders reject Jesus with every part of their being. And so Jesus turns and he focuses instead on the disciples. It is as though he's going to turn away from those who are completely blind, who will reject no matter what. And he turns instead to people who at least have a kind of a sight. And for the rest of the book, Jesus will focus on them to teach them his mission. Putting all of those pieces together and understanding the book as a whole, Mark is presenting us with these two core foundations. Who is Jesus? He is the Messiah. What will he do? He will suffer, die, and rise again. But the theme that connects all of these pieces together is the further question, do you believe in this Messiah? And if you read now through the book of Mark and you just watch for faith and unbelief, rejection or acceptance, if you read through the book and you watch for people's response to Jesus, now you're going to see the book coming together. Because as these two questions are presented, who is Jesus? He's the Messiah, the Son of God. Some people accept that joyfully. They accept his identity. Other people are completely offended and turn away. And as you come to the second half of the book, and the question is now presented, what will he do? He will suffer and he will die. Then you see the disciples hearing it and sort of understanding it, and yet not really not comfortable with it. And the rest of the book, actually, you discover the disciples constantly struggling with this. It's very clear that they, until the end, don't really get it, don't really accept that their leader will actually suffer and die. And the book presents you then with this question. So here he is. This is who he is. This is what he did. This is faith or unbelief in that fact. And the question then it presents to you as the reader and to me, do you believe in this Jesus? Do you have faith in this Messiah? What is your status before him? Is it a status or a response of faith or rejection? Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. Who is he? Here's his identity. First half of the book. Jesus did suffer and die. What did he do? Here it is. He came as a ransom for many. Do you accept or do you reject Jesus, the Messiah, his identity, and Jesus, the suffering servant who died? And it's your acceptance, your faith, your response to Jesus then that Mark places before you as the test of your relationship to him. So to conclude or to understand the book of Mark, here is this dramatic story set before us with these twin questions, and then the final question that's presented to us, what is our response? And I trust that by your understanding the richness of Mark's gospel, your response to Jesus is this: I hear, I know, I believe, and I accept who is Jesus, the Messiah, and his suffering on my behalf. And in response to that, to become a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, to become one of his disciples. This is who he is. This is what he did. What about you? Are you one of his disciples?